Can a movie be so brutal that decades later, governments still refuse to fully let it go? In the 80s video nasty era, horror did not just scare audiences, it triggered police raids, courtroom battles, banned shelves, and moral panic across entire countries. Some films were cut. Some were buried. Some still carry restrictions today. But the real question is darker. Were these movies dangerous, or did censorship make them immortal? Absurd, 1981. This is what happens when a slasher movie stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like a punishment. Absurd, released in 1981, came from the same grimy Italian exploitation pipeline that knew exactly how to turn forbidden violence into underground legend. Directed by Joe D'Amato, the film follows a seemingly unstoppable man whose body can heal at an unnatural speed, turning him into a walking nightmare of blades, blood, and sudden home invasion terror. On paper, it sounds almost supernatural. On screen, it feels much nastier, a slow, brutal, stalking film built around helpless victims, claustrophobic rooms, and violence that seems designed to make censors nervous. What made Absurd infamous was not just its plot, but its timing. In the early 80s, home video changed everything. Suddenly, films that would never have played in respectable theaters were sitting on rental shelves, often with lurid covers promising things audiences had never seen before. Absurd became tangled in that video nasty panic, where horror films were accused of corrupting viewers simply by existing. Today, its reputation is larger than the film itself. It may not be the slickest movie on this list, but that is exactly why it works. Absurd feels dirty, blunt, and dangerous, the kind of film that proves censorship can turn a low-budget shocker into a forbidden myth. Bloody Moon, 1981. Some slashers hide the knife until the final act. This one waves it in your face and dares you to keep watching. Bloody Moon, released in 1981, was directed by Jesus Franco, a filmmaker who spent his career crossing lines that more polite horror directors would not even approach. Set around a language school filled with young women, family secrets, and a killer with a deeply disturbed past, the film wears the shape of a murder mystery but beats with the heart of pure exploitation. What separates Bloody Moon from cleaner slashers of the era is its harsh, almost nasty directness. It does not have the polished suspense of a Hollywood production or the stylish elegance of Italian giallo at its best. Instead, it has the raw, uncomfortable feel of something made to shock late-night video renters. Its violence is sudden, cruel, and deliberately sensational, which made it an easy target during the 80s video nasty panic. But here is the twist. Banning films like Bloody Moon did not make them disappear. It made horror fans whisper about them. It turned cheap distribution into legend. It made the title sound more dangerous than 100 normal slashers. That is why Bloody Moon still belongs here. It is not remembered because it was refined. It is remembered because it looked like the exact kind of movie censors warned people not to touch. Nightmare, 1981. This was not the slasher parents were afraid their kids might accidentally rent. This was the one authorities treated like evidence. Nightmare, released in 1981, also known as Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, became one of the most notorious titles in the entire video nasty storm. The story follows a deeply disturbed man, released from psychiatric care, only for his violent impulses and traumatic visions to drag him back toward murder. But the film's real power comes from how ugly and unstable it feels. Unlike more playful slashers that turned murder into popcorn suspense, Nightmare has a grimy psychological edge. It leans into mental collapse, childhood trauma, and graphic violence, with a tone that feels less like entertainment and more like something discovered in a locked evidence box. That is exactly why it attracted so much controversy. During the early 80s, when politicians, newspapers, and campaigners were blaming horror videos for moral decay, Nightmare became a perfect villain. Its prosecution history gave it a reputation most films could never buy. Viewers did not just hear that it was scary. They heard it was forbidden, dangerous, maybe even socially harmful, and that made curiosity explode. Today, Nightmare remains one of the ugliest artifacts of that era. It is not smooth, glamorous, or easy to defend. But, as a piece of exploitation history, it is brutally effective. A film that turned censorship into its own marketing curse. Anthropophagus, 1980. Few horror films became infamous because of one scene, but this one built an entire underground legend around stomach-turning shock. Anthropophagus, released in 1980, is one of the defining Italian exploitation nightmares of the early 80s. Directed by Joe D'Amato, the film strands a group of travelers on a seemingly deserted Greek island, only for them to discover that something monstrous is hiding among the ruins, hunger, and silence. At first, it has the shape of a slow-burn island horror story. Empty streets, abandoned homes, a growing sense that the place has been stripped of life. But then the film twists into something far more savage, with a cannibalistic killer whose presence feels almost mythic in its cruelty. The violence is not constant, but when it arrives, it hits with the blunt force of exploitation cinema at its most shameless. During the video nasty era, Anthropophagus became one of those titles people talked about in half-rumors. Some viewers knew it only by reputation. Others knew it from banned lists, lurid descriptions, or whispered rental store stories. That mystery helped make it bigger than a normal horror release. What makes Anthropophagus powerful today is its atmosphere of decay. It feels sunburned, rotten, and cursed. It is not just about cannibal violence. It is about the feeling that civilization has already died before the characters arrive. Eaten Alive, 1980. This is cannibal cinema, with cult madness poured over it like gasoline. Eaten Alive, released in 1980, came from Umberto Lenzi, one of the key names in Italian exploitation's most infamous jungle horror cycle. It throws together missing person mystery, religious cult terror, jungle brutality, and survival horror into one feverish package that feels designed to offend every respectable critic in the room. The story follows a woman searching for her missing sister, leading her into a remote jungle settlement controlled by a dangerous cult leader. That setup gives the film a strange double threat. On one side, there is the classic cannibal exploitation fear of the wilderness as a violent, unknown world. On the other, there is the cult angle manipulation, isolation, blind obedience, and the terrifying idea that people can be trapped before they even realize they have lost control. Like many films in this cycle, Eaten Alive was controversial not only for fictional violence, but also for the ugly exploitation habits of the era, including scenes that made censors and animal rights critics furious. It became part of the broader video nasty conversation because it represented everything authorities feared about uncensored home video: brutality, sleaze, and taboo imagery available outside traditional control. It is not elegant cinema. It is not pretending to be. Eaten Alive is a wild, nasty artifact from a moment when exploitation films were testing how far the screen could go before someone slammed the door shut. Cannibal Apocalypse, 1980. This is what happens when a war movie comes home infected with something worse than trauma. Cannibal Apocalypse, released in 1980, is one of the strangest exploitation hybrids of the decade because it does not begin like a jungle cannibal film at all. Instead, it opens with the shadow of Vietnam, following veterans who return from combat carrying violent memories, buried guilt, and a horrifying appetite that turns trauma into contagion. That is what gives the film its nasty little hook. The danger is not hidden deep in the wilderness anymore. It has already come back to the city. The story follows a former soldier who realizes that the men he once fought beside are no longer simply damaged. They are infected with a cannibalistic urge that spreads like a disease. Suddenly, quiet American streets, movie theaters, hospitals, and suburban spaces become hunting grounds. That shift makes Cannibal Apocalypse feel different from the usual Italian shocker. It is not just about taboo violence. It is about the fear that war does not end when soldiers come home. It mutates, leaks into society, and turns familiar places into nightmares. Of course, the film still delivers the exploitation goods: biting attacks, bloody outbreaks, grimy suspense, and the kind of outrageous premise that could only survive in early 80s genre cinema. But underneath the madness is a sharper anxiety about violence returning to the people who tried to bury it. Cannibal Apocalypse is messy, weird, and unforgettable, a banned-era shock film with a disturbingly clever disease at its center. The New York Ripper, 1982. Some horror films want to scare you. This one seems determined to make the city itself feel contaminated. The New York Ripper, released in 1982, is one of Lucio Fulci's most controversial films, and even by exploitation standards, its reputation is unusually poisonous. Set in a dirty, hostile version of New York, the film follows a killer targeting women, while police chase clues through bars, streets, hotel rooms, and private lives that all seem coated in moral decay. This is not the glamorous New York of postcards. This is the city as a wound. What made the film so infamous was the way it fused the slasher boom with the nastier edge of Italian giallo. The murders are not stylish in a comfortable way. They are cruel, intimate, and deliberately unpleasant. Fulci does not soften the violence with charm or mystery. He pushes the audience into a world of suspicion, exploitation, and sexual menace, where almost every character feels damaged before the killer even appears. That is why censorship bodies reacted so strongly. The New York Ripper was not treated like a normal thriller with sharp edges. It was treated like something toxic, especially because of its violence against women and its grim, sleazy tone. But that controversy also made it legendary. Horror fans wanted to know what had frightened the censors so badly. Today, the film remains one of Fulci's most divisive works, ugly, harsh, and impossible to ignore. It is not comfortable viewing, and that is exactly why its banned reputation still feels earned. The House on the Edge of the Park, 1980. The most frightening thing about this film is not that strangers break into a home, it is how quickly civilization disappears once they do. The House on the Edge of the Park, released in 1980, came from Ruggero Deodato, the same director whose name became almost inseparable from censorship controversy. But instead of jungle horror, this film traps its brutality inside an elegant private party, where class, power, humiliation, and violence begin twisting around each other until the room feels impossible to escape. The story follows two criminals who enter the world of wealthy young people and turn a night of pleasure into a long psychological siege. On the surface, it looks like a home invasion thriller. But underneath, it is more disturbing because nobody in the film feels completely innocent. The rich characters play games of privilege and cruelty. The intruders bring rage, menace, and sadism. The result is a film where exploitation is not just in the violence, it is in the way people use each other. Its censorship history is easy to understand. The film's sexual violence, intimidation, and drawn-out humiliation made it a major target during the video nasty panic. It did not feel like a clean horror fantasy. It felt invasive, socially ugly, and too close to real-world fear. That is why The House on the Edge of the Park still has power. It is not the bloodiest film on this list, but it may be one of the most uncomfortable. It turns a stylish room into a moral trap and then makes the viewer sit there. Cannibal Ferox, 1981. If Cannibal Holocaust lit the match, Cannibal Ferox poured fuel over the entire forbidden film panic. Released in 1981, Cannibal Ferox, also known as Make Them Die Slowly, is one of the most notorious Italian cannibal films ever made. Directed by Umberto Lenzi, it follows a group of outsiders who travel into the Amazon and discover that the jungle is not the simple nightmare they expected. The film plays with the idea that so-called civilized people may be the real monsters, but it delivers that theme through some of the harshest exploitation imagery of its era. What made Cannibal Ferox so infamous was its mix of sadistic violence, jungle survival terror, and real animal cruelty, the kind of content that made censors react with immediate alarm. The film was marketed as being banned in dozens of countries, a claim that became part of its mythology whether viewers believed the number or not. In exploitation cinema, that kind of warning did not reduce interest. It created demand. The more forbidden it sounded, the more people wanted to know what was inside. The film's brutality is not polished or elegant. It is blunt, sweaty, mean-spirited, and designed to make the viewer feel trapped in hostile territory. That is exactly why it remains so controversial today. Cannibal Ferox is not simply remembered as a cannibal movie. It is remembered as a symbol of the moment when horror marketing, censorship, and moral outrage became impossible to separate. Madhouse, 1981. Some banned-era slashers became infamous because of gore. This one became infamous because its cruelty feels personal. Madhouse, released in 1981, is a brutal psychological slasher that fits perfectly into the 80s video nasty atmosphere. It follows Julia Sullivan, a young woman haunted by childhood trauma and the terrifying return of her disturbed twin sister, whose presence turns family history into something rotten, violent, and impossible to escape. What begins like a private nightmare slowly becomes a full-blown siege of paranoia, murder, and emotional punishment. What makes Madhouse more disturbing than a simple body count slasher is its atmosphere. The film does not just ask who will die next. It traps the viewer inside a world where birthdays, memories, hospitals, apartments, and family bonds all feel infected. There is something grim and mean about the way the story unfolds, as if the past has been waiting patiently for the perfect moment to attack. During the video nasty era, Madhouse became tangled in the same censorship panic that turned rough-edged horror into forbidden currency. It had enough violence, psychological ugliness, and disturbing imagery to make it feel dangerous on a rental shelf. Exactly the kind of film moral campaigners believed should never be casually available. Today, Madhouse works because it feels like a nightmare with no clean exit. It is not the most famous title on this list, but that gives it power. It feels like one of those cursed 80s tapes people discovered by mistake and never forgot. The Beast in Heat, 1977. Some films become infamous because they are shocking. This one became infamous because it seemed built to test how much ugliness a censor board could tolerate. The Beast in Heat, released in 1977, is not technically an 80s film, but its real notoriety exploded during the 80s video nasty era, when home video dragged extreme European exploitation into ordinary living rooms. Also known as SS Hellcamp, it belongs to the Nazi exploitation cycle, one of the most controversial corners of exploitation cinema, where war imagery, cruelty, and sensationalism were pushed into deeply uncomfortable territory. The film uses a wartime prison camp setting as a backdrop for sadism, humiliation, and extreme abuse. That alone made it a censorship target, but what truly damaged its reputation was the sense that it was not exploring history with seriousness. It was exploiting atrocity for shock value. For many viewers and classification boards, that crossed a line far beyond ordinary horror violence. It was not just brutal. It felt morally reckless. During the video nasty panic, titles like The Beast in Heat became symbols of everything. Campaigners feared lurid cover art, forbidden imports, underground circulation, and films that seemed to exist only because boundaries had disappeared. Its reputation grew precisely because so few people could legally see it. The less available it became, the more dangerous it sounded. That is why it earns a place here. The Beast in Heat is not famous for craft, elegance, or storytelling. It is famous because it sits at the edge of exploitation, cinema's darkest corridor, a film whose controversy may be more powerful than the film itself. The Gestapo's Last Orgy, 1977. This is the kind of title that does not merely ask whether a film can be banned, it asks whether some films were designed to make banning feel inevitable. The Gestapo's Last Orgy, released in 1977, became one of the most notorious Nazi-exploitation films connected to the 80s video nasty era. Like The Beast in Heat, it predates the decade, but its infamy was reborn when VHS made previously obscure exploitation titles easier to circulate, easier to fear, and easier for authorities to target. The film follows a former prisoner and a former camp officer crossing paths again after the war, using flashbacks to reveal a relationship built on power, trauma, obsession, and degradation. That premise could have been handled as psychological drama, but the film pushes into sensational exploitation instead. It uses historical horror not as a solemn warning, but as a stage for cruelty and taboo spectacle. That is where its reputation becomes so toxic. For censors, the problem was not simply violence, it was context. A film using wartime suffering and extreme abuse for shock entertainment carried a different moral weight than a normal slasher. It was not monsters, aliens, or masked killers. It was human cruelty dressed in historical nightmare, and that made classification far more difficult. Its long censorship history turned the Gestapo's Last Orgy into a forbidden object for collectors and horror historians. People discussed it less as a movie and more as evidence of exploitation cinema's most dangerous instincts. It belongs near the top because its controversy has never really cooled. Even decades later, it remains one of those films where the question is not just, is it brutal? But should this kind of brutality ever have been entertainment? Nekromantik, 1987. By the late 80s, horror had already shown audiences monsters, killers, cannibals, and maniacs. Then Nekromantik arrived and crossed into a kind of taboo most films would not even approach. Released in 1987, this West German underground exploitation film became infamous not because it had a giant budget or mainstream campaign, but because its subject matter felt almost impossible to discuss in polite company. It was grim, intimate, transgressive, and deliberately confrontational. Directed by Jörg Buttgereit, Nekromantik follows characters whose relationship with death moves far beyond ordinary horror. The film is built around decay, obsession, alienation, and necrophilia, using its disturbing premise not as a jump scare machine, but as a provocation. It feels cold and handmade, like something created outside the normal rules of cinema. That underground texture helped make it even more unsettling. It did not look like a studio horror film trying to shock audiences for profit. It looked like a secret document from a world most viewers did not want to enter. The controversy was immediate and lasting. Many banned films are censored because of violence, but Nekromantik was different. It challenged moral, sexual, and cultural boundaries all at once. That made it especially difficult for classification boards, because cutting a few moments could not erase the central taboo at the heart of the film. That is why Nekromantik sits so high on this list. It is not the loudest film here, it is not the biggest, but it may be the most unsettling in concept. It proves that exploitation does not always need armies, jungles, or killers. Sometimes the most forbidden horror is quiet, personal, and impossible to forget. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. No exploitation film on this list has a reputation this toxic, this legendary, or this impossible to separate from censorship history. Cannibal Holocaust, released in 1980, is the film that turned banned cinema into a global myth. Directed by Ruggero Deodato, it follows a rescue mission into the Amazon after a documentary crew disappears while filming indigenous tribes. What investigators find becomes a horrifying record of arrogance, cruelty, and media exploitation, and that is where the film's real power begins. The genius and danger of Cannibal Holocaust is that it does not simply show brutality. It accuses the viewer of consuming it. Long before found footage became a mainstream horror language, this film used fake documentary realism to make audiences question what was staged, what was authentic, and why they wanted to watch in the first place. That realism caused chaos. Deodato was famously forced to prove that the actors were alive after rumors spread that the film contained real killings. That alone would have made it infamous forever. But the controversy did not stop there. The film's graphic violence, sexual assault themes, colonial critique, and especially its real animal cruelty made it one of the most banned and censored films in history. Even people who defend its anti-media message often struggle with the methods used to deliver it. That contradiction is why Cannibal Holocaust deserves number 1. It is both smarter and uglier than many films that copied it. It is a condemnation of exploitation that became exploitation itself. Decades later, it remains the ultimate forbidden object, a film people still argue about because it never lets the audience feel innocent. These films were not just banned because they were brutal, they were banned because they made people argue about what cinema should be allowed to show. Some were trashy, some were disturbing, some were smarter than their reputations. But all of them became immortal the moment someone tried to bury them.